welcome to Pictorial Planet. My name's John Finch. Today's part 2 of our darkroom printing journey. We're going to look at what happens after we've developed our negatives. What's the next steps? What should we be doing as we prepare to make our first prints from those negatives? So let's take a look. After developing our film and letting the negatives completely dry, and that's important, I want to underline this, they need to be completely dry before you go on to this step. After developing the film and drying the negatives, we need to cut them and put them into protective sleeves. Now this is very important, and I don't want you to ever skimp this. They have to go into protective sleeves. You can't put them into envelopes and put them away like that. They're going to get damaged, they're going to get scratched. Now I've two types of sleeve here. I used to use a third type, a paper sleeve, which was very good. But the problem with the paper sleeve is you can't see through it. Whereas with these modern plastic sleeves, you can see through, you can see the negatives, and you can examine them. And we'll see more about that later. So very important, and also important, you buy archival plastic sleeves. Now I just want to add this. I don't like plastic in my life. You know, we're all trying to get rid of plastic. But this is one area that I can't seem to let go of plastic. And I think it's important to note that I use all of my sleeves. So I never throw these sleeves away. They're just used all the time, constantly. If not to move on to another film, if this is no good, I throw the negatives away and I reuse this sleeve. Or just to keep them forever locked up in this sleeve so that I've always got an archival record of my photographs. Now, this was one of the early sleeves that I bought, and as you can see, it kind of goes in two sides. There's one side here and one side over here, and it's in two halves. And you cut your film into 4 negatives a piece. But there's a problem with that. I've got here a negative. It's this one that I don't care about, so I can handle it like this. But I've got here a negative that's cut into 4, and when I take out my holder, you can see that the negative fits in it but doesn't overhang it in any way. So once I've got the negative inside here, I can't adjust it at all. It's too short. So the minimum size negatives that I need for the Magnifax 4 is 5, cut into 5s. And I suspect that many other enlargers are the same. So that meant this wasn't very practical for me to use this kind of sleeve. So I moved on to another sleeve, which I am happy with. Let me just put this over here. And this is the print file sleeve. I don't work for print file and I don't have any reason to advertise for them, but I do find that this is a good sleeve to use. It has 5 negatives in a row. It's archival according to them, so it will protect my negatives for a long time, and it also means that I can make a contact sheet very easily. We're going to make contact sheets today, so I'm going to show you how to do that. But it means I can keep my negatives inside this negative sleeve. I can examine them easily with a magnifier, and I can contact print them straight onto a sheet of paper without ever taking them out. And that, to me, is a huge advantage, not having to handle the negatives. Now, you'll see me handling my negatives with my hands today. I don't like to wear gloves at all, and I don't like to wear gloves when I'm handling negatives. I do think that they can introduce dust into your negatives, but even that aside, I find that I can use my hands and don't mark the negatives. So I wash them very carefully before I handle negatives to get rid of any oils that are on my skin. So here's a little tip. If you use regular soap to wash your hands, there could be oil left on your skin because regular soap can be super fatted, which means that there's oil actually in with the soap. And this oil is used to moisturize your skin. It's also a cleaning because like dissolves like, so oil dissolves oils, so it actually helps to clean. But if you've just washed your hands with a super fatted soap, you're going to get that oil onto your negatives. So I use washing up liquid, and I find that that's much better. It's not great for my skin, but I don't care about that. But it doesn't seem to leave any oily residue on my skin, so I can handle them. And of course, when I handle them, I only handle the edges. I don't put my fingers all over the negative. So we don't want to do that. All right, so there we are. That is a archival print file sleeve designed to contact print, and that's what we're going to move on to next. Before we do that, let me just quickly show you that they do 120 sleeves as well. I don't know if they do bigger than 120, but here is a 120 film which we'll be using today for our contact sheet, and in this series ultimately we'll be printing one of these negatives. And you can see I can print a whole set of 6x6 negatives from my Rolleiflex onto one sheet of paper. Really like this. So let's move on now and start looking at how we contact print these negatives. You could be asking, why make a contact sheet at all? It's an extra step getting in the way between you taking your photograph and seeing a print. And is it really worth it? I can see my negatives, right? I can look at them with a loupe and examine them very carefully on a light table. Why do I need to make a contact sheet? Well, there's something about when you see the negatives on a contact sheet, and I've just got one over here that I can show you, that changes everything. As soon as you've got your contact sheet, you can look more closely, examine the images more carefully, you can crop and see what they look like cropped. There's lots of things you can do with a contact sheet, and that's why I think it's a really important step between you filing your negatives and printing a print. As we go through these steps in our series, we're going to be using this contact sheet, and this is the one I made to demonstrate today. It's important that when we make our contact sheet that we have even light over the whole sheet. And as you know, it's quite a large sheet of paper. Now I've put an even larger sheet here just to demonstrate what I'm going to do now, but we need even light. And the way I do this is to first of all put a 50mm lens into my enlarger, because that spreads the light wider. It's a wider angle lens, if you like, than my regular 80mm that I use for my 120 film. So I've got my 50mm lens. The next thing I want to do is to rack up the focus right up to the top, because I want it completely out of focus. So I'm racking that up now, right up, so it's as close to the negative as possible. I'm now going to switch the lights off and show you how I'll lift the enlarger head up until we have a good size of light around this piece of paper. Let's turn the lights off and have a look at that. So there, I hope you can see, yes, you can see that. There is the circle at the moment of the light. And as I lift up the enlarger, it's going to get bigger and bigger. And I'm going to go quite a way up there. So I've really got good sizes, a good size right around the baseboard, because it's right in the middle that I'm going to be placing my negatives on top of a sheet of paper in my contact sheet printer. So here I have it. I've got it a good size now. I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to make a note of the height of the enlarger, because I'll use this every single time. And I'm going to close down my lens. Now I close down my lens 3 stops. That just happens to be the amount of light I need for my contact sheets. Your mileage may vary on how much to close your lens down, but what you're wanting is not to get contact sheets that take 2 or 3 seconds to expose. It's too short. You can't adjust very easily. It's such a fine line. The difference between 2 seconds and 3 seconds is 50%, and that's just too much. It's half a stop. So to find you, what you're looking at is around the 10-second mark. So adjust your light accordingly to get that 10-second-ish Goldilocks zone for your time. I have a density adjustment. We talked about it last week. I know many of you commented that you have density adjustments too. So brilliant. That's really great. We can adjust our density and allow more light, look, I'm adjusting it now, to get through. When you've found your Goldilocks zone, you want to write that down. Height of the enlarger, f-stop used, 50mm lens, what density you set on your density adjustment. And I set my grade to zone 1 or 2. I want slightly softer contact prints. That gives me more detail. Don't do contact prints at grade 3. If you're doing them at grade 3, you're not seeing as much detail in your highlights and shadows. So keep it a bit softer. Around about 1 or 2 is a good grade for contact sheets. All right, so now that I've got my light set up, I am going to make my contact sheet. Now here I've got some 6x6 negatives that I took, and as you can see I'm doing this in the light to demonstrate more clearly for you. I've placed them on a piece of paper. Now imagine if this was photographic paper. Emulsion side up, and your negatives should be emulsion side down. The emulsion should be as close as possible to the emulsion on the paper. I know there's going to be a very thin piece of plastic in between my emulsion and of the negative and the emulsion of the paper, but honestly it's so thin you won't notice a difference. So I leave them in the sleeves. It's much easier and safer just to keep them in the sleeve all the time. Now I have a piece of glass on the baseboard. I've shown you this before. I always use this big sheet of glass under my enlarger because it allows me to move the easel underneath the negative and get a nice crop, get exactly what I want. So it's useful also for this, because if you have a piece of glass under your enlarger, you can position your negatives under your paper, you can lift your glass, pop the negatives and paper underneath, pop the glass back down, and make your contact sheet. That's how I used to do it, but then I saw something very interesting online and I purchased it, and I'll show you that, because that is this. It's made by Printfile, and it basically is the same thing but portable. It has a nice thick sheet of glass on the top and some foam inside that's soft. I can put my paper and negatives in there, in the dark of course, and I can pop the lid down, the glass down, and boom, I can do a contact sheet very easily. Now Pt2, I think, make another contact sheet device, which I also have used many years ago, and it was perfectly good as well. So I'm not trying to sell you Printfile stuff. I'm just saying this is a very useful piece of kit, and there's different manufacturers that make these different pieces of kit. Very useful. All right, so once I've got my negatives there, emulsion down against the emulsion of the paper, press down with that piece of glass, I can then work out my exposure time for my contact sheet. I'm going to show you how we do that right now. Under the safe light, I cut a piece of photographic paper like this. This is ordinary paper, but this is the size that I cut. And I estimate it. It doesn't have to be exact. And this is what I'm going to use to create a test strip of my negatives. Now, if you use the same developer and the same negatives, the same film, all the time, you're going to have the same results, hopefully, if you're doing a good job. And so you'll know the times for your test strip. At least you'll know very closely, so it won't be as difficult. But this first time, I'm going to show you how we find that time for our contact sheets. So I've cut this strip, and I'm going to put it underneath the negatives like this. So there I have the strip, and I put it underneath the glass. Like that. I'll just tilt it so you can see it. So it's underneath, emulsion side up, and of course the negatives are emulsion side down. And it's very simple now. I just make my test strip just like I would make a regular test strip for a regular enlargement. I use my black card, I'll do it this side, and I cover it up. I give it 5 seconds, and then I cover it up, I give it another 5, I cover it up, I give it another 5, and so on. And I work down, covering up that piece of paper with different exposure times. I develop it, stop it and fix it, and dry it, and I have a look. So after that, you get a test strip that looks like this. And as you can see, I've used 5 seconds for these three, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Now, 5 seconds is too light. 10 seconds is probably slightly too dark. And then 15 seconds is definitely too dark. But I want to talk about this because this one in the middle, which is 10 seconds, is slightly too dark for normal viewing. But that's not how we're going to look at this at the contact sheet. Now, I got this idea from Eddie Ephraums, and I followed this technique of his, and I really quite like it. Eddie Ephraums was a proponent of slightly dark contact sheets. And the reason is he believed that it's good to see the highlight values properly. So print down a bit, print dark a bit, so you can see highlights very well. They're not burned out. And to see the shadows, look at the contact sheet with light behind it. Now I do that on my light table, but you can also do it with a window. You can put the contact sheet up against a window and look at the photographs, and the light is coming from behind through the paper. Let me show you that on my light table now. Here I have my test strip, and I've got it on the light table, but at the moment the light table is switched off. And as you can see, the 5 second, 10 second and 15 seconds, 15 is way too dark, 10 is slightly too dark, and 5 is too light. So if I was going to make a normal contact sheet from these timings, I'd probably choose something in between the 5 and the 10 seconds. I might go for 7.5, 8, or even 9. I'd have to do another test print to get those, and that's quite normal for me too. I would not always get this spot on straight away like this, but I'm happy with this 10 seconds. And the reason I'm happy is because I think you can see that the highlights on this apple here are, and on the edges of these leaves, there's some nice reflections on these leaves, are detailed. I've got detailed highlights. Now that's important to me because I need to see the detail in my highlights and the detail in my shadows. Of course, the problem is, because it's printed down slightly, it's slightly overprinted. Although the highlights are good, the shadows are a little dark for me to tell if there's detail in the shadows. But the trick here that Ephraums taught me in one of his books was to put light through from the back of it. So now if I switch that on, you can now see there is detail in the shadows. Now when I say you can now see, you probably can't see because it's a bit difficult for you, and it's difficult for me to video this. My camera just doesn't pick this up very well, but I can see detail in all the shadows now because light is coming through from behind. So I'm getting a really good impression of my images and which ones are printable. It helps me also check to see if I've got the right depth of field, because I can put a loop on this with the light coming in from behind, and I can examine the shadows and see if they're in focus as well. So I can test a couple of things here which are quite important as I'm choosing the particular negative that I want to print from. Now this is a test strip, so this is no good to me. What I need to do now I've decided that 10 seconds seems to be a good time for me to see my highlights and my shadows using this technique. I'm now going to make my complete contact sheet of all the negatives. So let's get that done, and then we'll have a look at all of them. I have my contact printing device here. I have my negatives and a piece of photographic paper. So I'm making sure my negatives cover the paper just right, top to bottom, left and right. Emulsion side up on the paper, emulsion side down on my negatives. And I'm going to put them inside the contact printer. So there they are. Happy with that. Put the glass down. I give it a little push just to make sure those negatives are really pushed hard onto that piece of paper. I'm going to use exactly the same settings that I used for my test strip. So I've got my enlarger set up exactly the same way. I've written this down and it's on my wall, so I do the same height and lens, f-stop and all of that the same every time. And I'm going to give 10 seconds at grade 1. So I'm definitely printing it soft, but that's going to help me identify the best image to print later. So here we go, 10 seconds. It's nice and evenly lit. And there, we've done our exposure. Let's get that through the developer stop and fix, and then we'll dry it and have a look. So I'm having a look at these now, this contact sheet, 10 seconds, and it's looking pretty good. But I do notice that these negatives along the top got a bit more exposure than the majority of them. And maybe these at the bottom, so I'm not too worried about those. But this one particularly has had a little more exposure. So let's burn those in a tad. I'm going to give them an extra third of a stop exposure. So back to the enlarger, we're going to make a second contact sheet, and I'll show you how to burn in the negatives. I've got the negatives back down on top of a piece of photographic paper and back inside my contact sheet printer. And now I know I have to burn these top negatives in by 1/3 to 2/3 of a stop. Now we had 10 seconds as our base exposure, so I'm going to look it up on my little calculator that's on the wall, and it's 12.6 seconds. So I'm going to give the initial 10-second burst, then I'm going to cover up the bottom negatives like so, and give the top ones an extra 2.6 seconds. So let's go. There's my 10 seconds. And I'm going to wind this down to 2.6. There. An extra third of a stop. Cover up the bottom negatives with a thick piece of black card. There. Let's develop that and see what they look like. And that looks better. You can see these have been printed down slightly now. So now I can see the highlight detail, which is what I wanted. And the rest are looking good. I'm happy with those. Let's look at the shadow detail now. And now with the light behind, I can see the shadow details. I like those. I can start to choose which of these negatives I want to print first of all. And I'm going to get the loop involved here so that I can really check focus, depth of field, and then I'll be able to choose which one I want. You can do this up against a window, so you don't need a light table to do this technique. And I think if you try it out a couple of times, you'll start to get used to it, you'll start to like it. It's quite a good technique, and thank you, Eddie Ephraums, for that. Well, I hope you found that interesting. Next week, we're going to be picking one of those contact prints and turning it into a real print. One of my favorite parts of photography is seeing the photograph in my hands on a piece of paper. In fact, I don't think a photograph is real until it's printed on a piece of paper. So that's exciting, and the week after that, we're going to be looking at split grade printing. So why don't you subscribe to the channel, like this video. Before I go, I want to say thank you to my patrons. You guys bring this channel to the public. You are making this all possible. So a huge big thumbs up and thanks to you guys. And I'll see you all next time.